Welcome to another episode of the New Quantum Era. I'm your host, Sebastian Hassinger. Today's conversation is with Daniel Lidar, a professor at the University of Southern California and another pioneering researcher in the field of quantum computing. I first met Daniel around 2018 when I was creating the Researcher Access Program at IBM Quantum, and Daniel proposed a very interesting experiment involving random circuit sampling and dynamical decoupling on IBM's 54-qubit device, which was not yet launched at that point. As new as I was to the field, I was still struck by Daniel's novel and creative thinking about mitigating noise and probing the limits of what the hardware could do. Dynamical decoupling is really fascinating because it's injecting non-logical gate pulses in between the logical gate operations. And those pulses have the effect of stabilizing and mitigating the noise that can build up in an idle qubit. So that was sort of an introduction to that topic from Daniel, and I found it really interesting. His career goes back to a very common starting point for many quantum computing experts, the publishing of Shor's algorithm in 1995. And he's been involved in many important explorations and innovations since then. We met and recorded this interview at the APS Summit with the kind assistance of the American Physical Society. Daniel takes me through some of his own origin story and experiences with quantum annealing, quantum error correction, and his new efforts to create accurate models of physical qubits powered by GPUs with the startup he co-founded, Quantum Elements, which is really interesting. I really enjoyed catching up with Daniel, and I hope you find our conversation as fascinating as I did. Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Sebastian. It's great to be here.
So we've known each other for a while professionally. First when I was working at IBM and now at AWS. You've been involved in quantum computing for quite some time. Your roots go back to very early days of the field. How did you first sort of get involved?
Yeah, well, I got started towards the middle of my PhD back in 1995, so it's been 30 years.
Yeah.
Unbelievably. I was working on scattering theory and fractals, and I was getting a little disillusioned with those areas, and then I had the good fortune of running into somebody who I believe was a former podcast guest of yours, Dori Taronov.
Oh, yeah.
We were grad students at the same time at Hebrew U, and she had just started her PhD in the area, and she told me about this amazing algorithm called Shor's algorithm.
Right.
And
she told me the story of her advisor saying, read this paper or do something with it.
Well, she certainly got me excited and interested, and I decided to make a big switch and never look back.
That's amazing. And so from 95 is quite a fortuitous time to get involved in quantum computing, although it did require a lot of patience to stick with it. I assume sort of was your initial interest in sort of the exploration of the algorithms that might provide some kind of quantum advantage from a theoretical point of view?
That's right, yeah. So back in those days, I wanted to look at whether there were other algorithms that could provide quantum advantage. And my very first paper ever was on simulating Ising models, classical Ising models. We actually found a very modest type of quantum advantage in that context. And that led to a postdoc at Berkeley. At the time, it was rare to find any postdocs in quantum computing.
Right.
I found one in the chemistry department at Berkeley, which was a great place to be because Berkeley had Alex Pines, who was doing pioneering experiments in NMR, quantum computing.
Right.
And Birgit Whaley was my postdoc advisor, and a theoretical chemist by the name of Bill Miller was my second postdoc advisor. And a point at which I got interested in error correction and error suppression, and started working on decoherence-free subspaces.
Interesting. And so that icing model, was that the connection to D-Wave when D-Wave came out with their first machine? Their quantum annealing device is a simulation of an icing model, right? That's sort of the fundamental capability of the device.
Yeah, so actually the connection I had with D-Wave happened several years later, and it's interesting, you should ask if it's connected to that old Ising model work. That actually never occurred to me.
Oh, really?
I ran into the founder of D-Wave when I was in Toronto. Got my first faculty position there after 3 years at Berkeley, and Canada was a place where a lot of really interesting quantum computing work was happening. The Perimeter Institute was just starting up at that time. They were in their old building that had an amazing coffee machine in a very interesting architecturally looking building. And Jordy and I met accidentally, and he told me about what he was up to, setting up this new company that was interested in quantum annealing. So that's how that got started.
Okay. So it was serendipitous, and the topic of your prior research never came up. That's interesting. But I mean, it is an Ising model simulation that's sort of the bread and butter of a quantum annealing device, right?
Yeah, a quantum annealing device as we have them now, those are devices that are basically transverse field Ising model type simulators. The work that I was referring to that I did during my PhD was really about a classical Ising model. Okay. And it is related, because you could think about what an annealer does is trying to find the ground state or a good approximation to the ground state of a classical Ising model.
Right.
But the way it gets there is actually very interesting, because it involves a quantum path. You start from a strong field along the x direction that prepares a uniform superposition of all spins or all the qubits, and then you slowly turn off that transverse field, and at the same time you turn on the Ising Hamiltonian whose ground state you're interested in, and the path from that uniform superposition to the ground state of the Ising model is fairly arbitrary. There's a lot of inherent robustness in the annealing approach in that regard, but that path necessarily takes you through a quantum critical point where the energy gap gets very small, and that determines how fast you can run your calculation. It's important not to excite out of the ground state. So the speed at which you can solve a quantum annealing problem is really set by the minimum quantum gap you encounter along this path from uniform field to the final Ising model. But the trajectory itself involves a lot of interesting quantum dynamics, and if you go a little too fast and you get excitations, then there are interesting physics to be observed. For example, Kibble-Zurich mechanism is one popular area of study in that regard. So there's a lot of quantum effects that are at play in trying to find the ground state of the final Ising model.
Okay. And I mean, you were involved in some early research papers when they shipped their first device, is that right?
Yes. So this actually, fast forward to 2010 or 11.
Right.
I had by then already moved from Toronto to USC. I moved there in 2005, and had not stayed in touch with D-Wave. But serendipitously, I had a visit from somebody by the name of Ned Allen, who was the chief scientist of Skunk Works at Lockheed Martin.
Okay.
Who
the name was familiar, the Skunk Works. Okay, cool.
Yeah. And so Ned walked into my office and started telling me about a problem that Lockheed was encountering with the F-35 fighter jet. I told him that I knew very little about fighter jets, but he persisted. And he told me that the problem was one of essentially software debugging. They were spending a lot of money on this. And the problem was getting worse and worse because, as is the nature with these very complicated machines, you get millions of lines of code, and that just keeps growing, and the debugging problem gets harder and harder. And he wanted to know whether there was anything in the quantum domain that could help them with software debugging. Mind you, again, this was 2010.
Yeah.
So I told him I didn't think so, but that if he wanted to work with any kind of quantum hardware manufacturer, at that time there was basically just one game in town, and that was D-Wave.
Right.
So he got interested, and we both took a trip to Vancouver. And long story short, what happened was that Lockheed decided to invest in buying the very first commercial quantum computer, which was the D-Wave that ended up at USC in 2011. And from my perspective, the goal was to try to understand the claims that were circulating around that time about whether D-Wave was actually performing some type of quantum computation. And there's no black or white there. It's always a bit of a gray area when there's decoherence. And we knew that there was a lot of decoherence in those devices. But I wanted to understand to what extent we could quantify the quantumness. And also to see if we could introduce error correction techniques into this area, which we did. And to look at algorithms that we could run on these devices.
Sorry to interrupt, but error correction on annealing, I guess I was thinking that error correction was directly associated with gate operations, and an annealer is an analog device. What would the flavor of an error correction be in an analog in an annealing device?
Yeah, that's right. And so that was a bit of a dilemma at the time. How do we even approach error correction in the first place? But fortunately, there were very relevant ideas from the field of topological quantum computing, actually. So the basic idea is that if you can create an energy penalty against errors that, in this case, excite you out of the ground state, then this forms a type of, properly, it's really error suppression, not quite error correction. So the first idea was, let's suppress errors that create excitations. But in addition, there are some simple codes that could be applied as well. Because what you can do is, and this is a little technical, but you can take a Hamiltonian, in this case transist field Ising Hamiltonian, and you can replace every spin operator with the logical operator of some error correcting code. And as soon as you do that, now you have the ability to use that code as an error detecting code, at the very least, even if it's not an error correcting code. So strictly speaking, what we did was in a sense that replacing the bare Ising model Hamiltonian, transist field Ising Hamiltonian, with the encoded version with respect to some code. Particularly, it was actually just a simple repetition code that was a good fit for these devices. And then you get the benefit of this energy gap protection that I mentioned, energy penalty against excitation errors, as well as the ability to detect any errors at the end of a run and then essentially perform post-selection on the results.
I see. Interesting. That's really fascinating. So did the D-Wave help Lockheed with the debugging problem?
And not as far as I know. And it was understood pretty early on that this was not going to be a good application area. But Lockheed remained invested in this area for quite a long time. And I actually credit the whole birth of commercial quantum computing with the vision that Ned Allen had at the time. Because in 2010, 2011, no commercial quantum computers were sold anywhere. So this sale that happened actually triggered a lot of subsequent activity.
Interesting.
Google, 2 years later, bought a D-Wave machine that they put at NASA, and I was actually somewhat involved in that story. Had the chance to talk to the head of NASA at the time and make the case that this could be an interesting thing for them to explore. And if you look at the work that Google did in quantum computing, it actually all started with their work on quantum annealing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then later they decided that they could build a gate-based machine in-house. But yeah, those early days in the early 2010s were the very beginning of commercial quantum computing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so interesting. There's I think a general sort of I wouldn't skepticism is too strong a word, but feeling that if D-Wave's devices had advantage, that there'd be more proof, more evidence of that at this stage. That in some sense, I think annealing and analog operations in general, analog quantum operations in general, are sort of discounted as being too hard to control, or they don't map as well to practical problems as we thought. But you still think that there is significant value in the operation that you can support on those devices.
I do believe that. I think there are multiple paths towards practical applications of quantum computing, and at this point, really nobody knows for sure.
That's true.
What the ultimate
it's not
winning.
like the naysayers for quantum annealing have a really good counterpoint. Oh, here's the thing. It's all still speculative to a certain degree.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation. There's also a lot of great work that establishes rigorous results.
Yeah.
And perhaps the most significant critique of quantum annealing is that there is no analog to the quantum fault tolerance results in quantum annealing. But in terms of hardcore results from quantum annealing delivering quantum advantage, it actually is the case that there are some really interesting breakthroughs as of late. So, for example, D-Wave themselves published a paper not long ago, just a few days ago actually, on a computational quantum advantage in terms of quantum simulation. They got some pushback, but that's true for all types of quantum advantage results. I have work that will come out pretty soon on demonstrating a computational quantum advantage result, not in simulation, but actually in the original quest to do so in the context of optimization. But importantly, it's not in the context of exact optimization, because that seems to be very difficult to do due to the presence of noise and the finite temperature and so on. So instead, actually, the advantage result is in the context of approximate optimization, where what we showed was, with the help of these same kind of error correction methods, error suppression and detection methods, to be precise, that I was talking about earlier, that for some well-chosen optimization problems that are natively embeddable on the D-Wave chip, so I want to stress those are not application-level problems, it is actually the case that we were able to show that we could solve these problems with a time-to-solution scaling that is better than the best classical algorithms that we were able to benchmark against. And here there's always this catch when somebody makes a quantum computational advantage claim. Well, in some cases you can prove that there's no better algorithm, classical algorithm out there. But in most cases, certainly in all cases almost of practical interest, we don't have a proof of what the best classical algorithm is. So you end up performing some kind of a test, a benchmark test against heuristic algorithms or the best known algorithms, classical algorithms. So that is the case here. We benchmarked against the best currently available classical algorithms, and we found a better scaling of the time to solution, scaling with problem size for the D-Wave device in this case.
That's really interesting. I suppose the nice side effect of not having definitive proof means that it's a motivator to the classical algorithm designers to come up with better approaches to try to compete, which is good for everybody, I think. So
that is absolutely true, and I fully expect that this race will continue between very clever classical algorithm design, and I'll actually be both happy and unsurprised if we find out that there's something better we could have done, because that will keep pushing the envelope for everyone.
Absolutely. You've also sort of done work in quantum advantage, proof of quantum advantage with those caveats that it's best known, sort of benchmarking on the IBM devices as well recently, right?
That's right, but actually in this case, we try to find problems for which we can make rigorous statements about quantum advantage. So there are quantum advantage results that rely on conjectures. So what I mean by that is, for example, quantum supremacy in the style of random circuit sampling.
Right.
essentially boils down to if a certain computational complexity conjecture is true, something like does P equal NP? It's not exactly that, but it's close enough. Then you can prove that random circuit sampling cannot be beaten classically. Right. Or quantum simulation, where you use a quantum computer to perform a simulation of a quantum system, relies on another type of conjecture, which is that simulating quantum mechanics itself is hard on a classical computer. It's widely believed, but it's still a conjecture.
Right.
On the other hand, there are some problems for which we do actually know what is the best classical algorithm. And typically those arise in the context of so-called black box or oracle type problems,
right.
Like Bernstein-Vazirani or Simon's problem. Those are very early problems from the very early days of the founding of quantum computing. And in those cases, we know rigorously that a quantum computer is going to beat the best possible classical algorithm. So that's the context in which we actually demonstrated quantum advantage, in this case using IBM devices. First, in 2023, a paper that used a 27-qubit IBM device.
Right.
And demonstrated, again, a better scaling of the time to solution for the Bernstein-Vazirani problem on up to 27 qubits. And that doesn't sound like a lot of qubits, but nevertheless, when you see an exponential scaling versus something that is sub-exponential, the exponential scaling being the classical scaling for this problem, versus the sub-exponential quantum scaling on the IBM devices, then it's quite clear that you have an advantage. And here too, the key was to use some kind of error suppression method, very different from the type that we used on the D-Wave devices. In this case, I'm talking about dynamical decoupling, which is an error suppression method.
Yeah.
We can talk about what that is, but let me just mention that then we had a follow-up result, which is still being peer-reviewed, and that is a quantum advantage at the 127 qubit level. So going up to 127 qubits, because you always want to look at time to solution as a function of problem size.
Right.
And this was for Simon's problem. And Simon's problem is actually a very interesting problem because it was the precursor to Shor's algorithm. Essentially, it's about period finding.
Right.
So the result there.
Does it use quantum phase estimation as well, or is that something that Shor added in?
That is something that is more special to Shor's algorithm.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But there is essentially, you could say that yes, there is a type of Fourier transform that happens in Simon's algorithm as well.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. So, okay, so you, in that case, you used dynamical decoupling as well on the 127 qubit?
Yeah. So what happened was that when we tried to run these algorithms, Bernstein-Vazirani and Simon's algorithm later, without doing any kind of error suppression, the results were not good.
Right.
There was essentially no quantum advantage to be seen. And I just want to make clear that when I say quantum advantage, what I'm talking about is the scaling of the time to solution as a function of problem size. Right?
Okay.
So we're not talking about 100x speed up or something like that. Right? It's crucial that you look at as a function of problem size. This is really the heart of the claim of a quantum computational speedup. It is an advantage that grows as a polynomial or maybe as an exponential in the best case as a function of the number of variables in the problem, which is the number of qubits in this case. So that's what we're talking about here. Time to solution is a function of the number of qubits.
Okay.
And in that context, it turned out that there was no advantage to be seen if you ran the problem in its naked form.
Right.
But then we tried to do error suppression using dynamical decoupling, and dynamical decoupling is a fascinating field. It has its origins in actually in the Han-Echo experiment from 1950. It's really the basis for NMR and magnetic resonance imaging as we know it. So there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that the NMR community has developed in this context. But the quantum information community has also contributed greatly to the development of these dynamical decoupling sequences that you can think of as essentially suppressing decoherence. They don't error correct, they merely suppress.
Right.
But in the context of running an algorithm on NISQ devices, this can be extremely powerful. And that's what actually made the difference when we able to successfully demonstrate quantum advantage.
And these are microwave pulses that you inject in between gate operations on a qubit, right? That's essentially what dynamical decoupling is?
Yeah, dynamical decoupling is what you said. So the way that you use these pulses is, in its simplest form, if you look at a quantum circuit, typically there are what we like to call idle gaps. And
right.
So every qubit is at some point just sitting around waiting for something to happen while the other qubits are being acted upon by gates. And while a qubit is sitting idle, it decoheres.
Right.
So rather than letting it decohere, the idea is let's try to prevent it from decohering or slow down its decoherence as much as possible. And so this is where dynamical decoupling comes in. What you can do is you can fire pulses at this qubit or a group of qubits that are not doing anything. Mm-hmm. And a simple way to think about the way this works, by no means the actual more elaborate way in which it was eventually done, is that dynamical decoupling is like doing time reversal. Essentially, you're flipping the sign of the interaction between that qubit and its environment.
I see.
And you constantly flip it back and forth, and so it's as if somebody's walking forward and backward,
right.
and on average they're going nowhere. And that's what this qubit is doing.
So do you have to make sure that you return it to its original sign before the next operation? So there is some kind of structure to the dynamical decoupling that's got to be structured.
There is a ton of structure to these sequences, and yes, that's right. So ideally, you would like a dynamical decoupling sequence to complete an identity operation.
Okay.
But that identity operation is a non-trivial identity because it forces the qubit environment to cancel out up to some order.
Right.
This is not complete error correction. Let's be very clear about that. There's no entropy is being removed from the circuit. In fact, you're injecting some entropy because there's no such thing as perfect operation.
Non-intuitive is that it feels like that would increase the overall noise of the circuit, but you're actually acting to suppress the noise.
Yeah, so if you try to do dynamical decoupling naively, it's not going to work. And by naively, what I mean is if you use pulses that aren't themselves self-correcting. So we now know that there exist pulse sequences that have an inherent, I think it's fair to say, fault tolerance built into them. They self-correct over the course of a full cycle. So if there is some coherent error buildup, because there's a little bit of over-rotation or the wrong axis being rotated around, as you apply a sequence like that, a cleverly designed dynamical decoupling sequence is going to take care of that and is going to eventually get you to the identity operation at the end of the cycle, despite the fact that there were errors along the way.
Right. And I mean, more recent, and I think actually presenting this week at APS, work that includes logical dynamical decoupling, or LDD, I think you're referring to as, right? Yeah,
that's right. So you can take this up to the next level. Instead of just looking for gaps where a qubit is sitting around doing nothing and addressing it with dynamical decoupling this way, you can combine ideas from dynamical decoupling with ideas from quantum error correction. And logical dynamical decoupling, or LDD, is the idea of using the logical operators of a quantum error correcting or quantum error detecting code. And those operations, those logical operators, can have the same effect as what I described before. But there's one major advantage in using logical operations of a code as dynamical decoupling operations, and that is that now you can naturally combine dynamical decoupling with an error correcting or error detecting code. They now literally fit hand in glove, and they reinforce each other. So in particular, logical dynamical decoupling can actually suppress the logical errors that a code is not able to deal with.
Does that effectively sort of increase the D value for that code then?
By the D value, you mean the distance, of the code?
Yeah.
Yes, the way that the construction in our new LDD paper works is essentially that's what happens. You can change the distance of the code. You can even use an error detecting code essentially as an error correcting code in this context. And the reason it works is because when you apply these logical dynamical decoupling pulses, again, they remove all logical errors, or not completely remove, they suppress all logical errors that the code by design was not able to cope with. In addition, They also suppress some of the physical errors that the code was designed to deal with. And what's left over is a subset of all the errors that the code was originally supposed to correct. And because you've now removed some of the errors, the code is now essentially a higher distance code. It has to do less work.
Right. That's spectacular. Is this theoretical work, or have you actually carried this out experimentally at this point?
We have carried it out experimentally. There's a theorem in this new work that formalizes everything I just said. But yeah, we used this approach to, for the first time on a transmon qubit processor, demonstrate high fidelity logical Bell state generation. So beyond generation, we generate logical Bell states. In this case, the context is the 422 code. So it's just really just 4 physical qubits, a code that gives you 2 logical qubits out of 4 physical qubits. And those 2 logical qubits, we prepare a Bell state, a logical Bell state. And then we show that we can, using dynamical decoupling in this form, in combination with the properties of the 422 error detecting code, keep those logical Bell states alive for much longer than is possible if you don't do any of this, but also much longer than is possible if you only use the 422 code itself as an error detecting code with post selection.
So this is a 4-qubit device. Was this in a university lab, or is it whose device was it?
This was actually on the IBM over the cloud devices on the latest and greatest machines from IBM. 4-qubit code in this case, just because we wanted to start with something simple.
I see.
And then, of course, there are a lot more physical qubits on these devices. So in fact, we're able to leverage the parallelism that you get from running many copies at once.
I see. Would that be, would that be sort of the path forward? Would that be to increase the physical qubits you're involving in the logical code, or would it be to do more of these sort of parallel smaller units?
Oh, definitely the former. So
okay.
The next thing we'd like to do is demonstrate that we can make a high fidelity, logical, entangled states with much larger codes.
And the IBM chips still have the heavy hex layout, so it's 2 or 3 connections, I believe, per qubit. Would there be any advantage in more of a lattice layout, like the Google chip or the IQM chip or Nakamura-san's chip from Riken? They're all, they each have 4 connections. It's all nearest neighbor connections. Would that affect the performance of the logical code?
Yes, higher connectivity as a general rule is always better because it reduces the number of swap operations that you have to perform. Every time you have to perform a swap, you're losing a little bit. So yes, I'm a fan of highly connected architectures.
Yeah. And talking of architectures, what about this sort of, it feels like we're at this point now where plain vanilla transmons to a certain degree are falling away, and you're getting cat qubits, dual rail qubits, IBM's new plan, the chip that's in the works is a implementation of a QLDPC architected chip. Do you think that there'll be advantages, or can you adapt your approach to those sort of more esoteric kind of designs of and layouts of chips?
Yeah, absolutely. These results are all fairly agnostic, ultimately about the specifics of the qubits, the architecture, because they're based on general design principles. The 422 code, for example, is a code that you can put on pretty much any modality and any type of architecture. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to working with these fancier, even better qubits.
I know, there's so many coming down the pipe. It's very exciting. And I guess the last topic I want to touch on, underlying all of this seems to be, you mentioned sort of getting fascinated with sources of noise and characterization of noise. And of course, that's the motivator for getting better at error correction. You've done a lot of work even in simulation of noise. Is there something sort of emerging in our understanding of how noise causes problems in chips that's helping us improve sort of the overall performance? Yes, obviously error correction, but I guess in a more fundamental way, do we understand quantum noise better than we did a decade ago?
Yeah, that's a deep question with a lot we could go into there. So the short answer to your question is, of course, yes. But the point is really that error models are getting better and in certain important ways. So a lot of the results about, for example, the accuracy threshold, fault tolerance, are based on rather simple error models. Typically,
Right.
the error model is a type of Monte Carlo simulation where you take, let's say, a depolarizing channel or any kind of noise channel, and essentially you imagine you have a circuit and you sprinkle errors at random in the
Right.
circuit, and then you can simulate the effect of that noise, and you calculate some kind of a fidelity quantity, and you can extrapolate that to different size. From using different sizes, you can extrapolate and you can obtain a threshold type result. The problem is that real life noise isn't at all like that. It's not necessarily Markovian. It has memory characteristics. In other words, it can be correlated in time, and it can also be correlated in space. And a more sophisticated understanding of these more realistic noise models is absolutely essential in order to get realistic results about accuracy thresholds and the performance of error correcting codes more generally. And I think that is an extremely rich and important area that the community has tried to move towards, and there are some people who are working on it for a while. That is accounting for non-Markovian type of effects, correlated errors. But there's a lot that remains to be done in order to improve our confidence in the claims that are being made around particular threshold values. So I'm always a bit skeptical when I hear a number like we have a threshold of, let's say, 1%. Did you properly account for all non-Markovian effects in arriving at this number, for example? And typically the answer is probably not. So I've actually started a company that is trying to take this problem seriously. It's called Quantum Elements. We're building open system quantum simulation software that is trying to be as accurate and realistic as possible. One of the goals is to try to provide more accurate estimates of real noise to the community and to customers who are building quantum hardware.
And the models that you're building, are those, are you creating sort of a mathematical model for a better model of how the noise behaves, or are you training a machine learning model to mimic the real world noise?
So we're trying to build better models. We're trying to also develop techniques that will help with speeding up the simulation problem here, because this is a classical simulation problem.
Yeah.
This is why we need quantum computers
Right.
in the first place. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle and a bootstrapping going on here. So the emphasis is on building more accurate models, faster solution methods for these types of models. And about AI, the role of AI here is to essentially plug into a feedback loop between the error models, simulations, and actual devices, learn the noise from the devices in order to improve the error models and so on.
Right. And you mentioned before we started recording that Quantum Elements is now playing a role in the bring-up process for, I can easily imagine Quantum Elements being useful in the design and simulation of the qubits you're building, and the testing and the R&D process, but in terms of operationally bringing qubits up, how does that noise model help?
Yeah, so we're very interested in this bring-up problem. The bring-up problem is essentially, I like to think of it as somebody delivers a piano to your house, and you are not an experienced piano player and certainly not a piano tuner. So you start to play your piano and it sounds a little off, and so now you need to call in a tuner. So that's the bring-up problem. There's a lot of role here for an open system simulator of the type that I talked about before, connecting to that hardware in order to learn the noise on that particular hardware and help with not just error correction, that actually comes later, but also with calibration and getting the processor ready to be used at a level at which it operates as close to optimal as possible with the highest possible fidelities and so on.
Right. That makes total sense now that I think about it. I mean, there's a whole team in a typical quantum hardware R&D team that's just calibrating the machine to try to make it, its operational state as optimal as possible.
That's right. This is exactly the pain point that we are trying to address. And I remember as a graduate student walking into an optics lab and seeing all these lasers on an optical table and being very impressed with how much work was being done to align all the lasers. And I was told then that it could easily be a PhD to just get all that alignment going before you get an experiment. And so there's been a lot of automation in that area, and it's time to bring that automation to bear also on superconducting qubits and spin qubits. Those are the two particular modalities that we're interested in.
Fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you very much. It's been super interesting, and I always enjoy talking with you, and this has been no exception, so thank you.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
That's it for another episode. Thanks for listening as always. Thank you for Dr. Daniel Lidar for his time. Thanks to APS for their support. The podcast is a production of the New Quantum Era, hosted by me, Sebastian Hassinger, with theme music by Omar Costa Hamido. You can find past episodes on www.newquantumera.com or on Blue Sky at newquantumera.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and tell your quantum curious friends to give it a listen.